So, thank you for a wonderful, interesting, and provocative presentation.
It is on.
Is it on? Is it on? There we go. All right. So, I know that you'd like to start.
Question.
All right. There you go.
I whispered it to her, and she said, "I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole." The question is, what about Israel? She knows what I mean.
Okay.
Just explain why you don't want to touch it.
Why do I not want to touch it with a 10-foot pole?
Because we're doing it Sunday morning.
Because you're doing it Sunday morning. Thank you. I'm a puppet. I don't want to talk about Israel because it makes many American Jews, including myself, extremely uncomfortable to have those conversations in a public setting without acrimony and unpolite, uncivil disagreement. And I think that this is really hard. I think that it is the biggest taboo in the American Jewish community today. I also think that it is the biggest opportunity to learn how to listen to one another when we disagree. And there's a conference in Washington next weekend, this weekend, J Street Conference, which I think is going to be very interesting. I wish I could go. Jacques would have to report back. But I think that there is change afoot in the Jewish community today about Israel. I think that there are structural realignment forces. I think that the discourse around Israel that is promulgated by AIPAC is extremely alienating to people under 40, and it is not reaching them, which is why J Street has become hugely successful and popular and appealing. I think programs like Encounter, which takes American Jews to the West Bank to talk to Palestinians for 3 days and facilitates homestays in Palestinian homes in Bethlehem, is changing the conversation, particularly amongst the clergy in North America. I don't think that there's any consensus or agreement about Israel and Israel's policies. And I know that this is just a very difficult conversation. And in every research study I've done in the past 5 years, regardless of which group I'm looking at, young Jews, interfaith families, queer people, the issue of Israel creates silence in interviews, which is why I feel like, I don't know what to say, because it's so complex. It's the white elephant we don't want to talk about.
Can I also offer that I enjoyed looking into new Jews precisely also because I think that it helps us to see that, in fact, our Jewish lives have become centered on so many various parts of human experience that Israel has a place in some Jewish lives, much more so than in others. And as you point out, from Buenos Aires to Moscow, to San Francisco and D.C. We have very rich Jewish lives, and we're not all looking to make Aliyah. Some will, and some leave Israel as well and come here and there. But I think that it's also very interesting that you've raised in your book, particularly that one, the possibility for us living very rich Jewish lives in so many different ways. While this is a congregational setting, obviously, as you've also challenged us to think about, there are many other settings for Jewish lives that we're here to entertain. And I know in Israel, there is particularly much more diversity in organizational form there that are evolving. You know. Anybody like to jump in here?
Ben?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Karen. It was fantastic, everything I had hoped it would be. One of my one-liners I like to use on the question of Israel is the standard propaganda line of the organized Jewish community is that what unites the Jews is God, Torah, and Israel. And the reality is that nothing divides Jews more than God, Torah, and Israel.
The Torah less so, because you can just look at it as literature.
Yeah,
not in Israel.
Right, you can talk about it as literature, but also Torah in terms of halakha, practice, who is a Jew. I mean, you can it's clearly, we're as divisive as ever. The joke is that we've gone from being the chosen people to being the choosy people. So we complain about everything. But what I wanted to highlight was something that you alluded to, but didn't necessarily make explicit in your presentation, in talking about the interfaith family experience, or intercultural families, we sometimes will describe them. But it also applies to the LGBT community and also to the secular community on some level. There's this balance of the them versus us. That vocabulary is very important. Do you ignore them and say, well, they better just like our program or else? Do you create special, almost like segregated programs for them? Or the third sort of subtle option is, do you have to transform the main program so that it now includes them? And one thing that we had talked about in advance of the conference was the trend in some LGBT communities away from separate synagogues that are only defined by that gender and sexual identity, which doesn't mean they believe the same things or practice the same way, and towards an integration into more so-called mainstream congregations that have themselves become more accepting in terms of ordaining and even hiring gay rabbis and so on. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about that, because here's where it applies to us. You see, all too often, sort of like Jacques mentioned with Chabad, the approach is, well, it doesn't matter what you believe, it's only what you practice, so do what we do. On some level, that was the Reconstructionist approach originally, was it didn't matter what you believe, because we do Jewish, in that phrase that you hate. So our challenge was to say, well, we have to step out and do something different. So now the question becomes, do we need this separate identity, or is there a way that the program in the general world has changed enough that we can work our way back in? Or on the flip side, is what we have done is transform the program for the cultural Jew. That is, in many of our communities, we haven't simply edited the traditional prayers and it's all in Hebrew and there's no adjustments and it's just sort of cutting out words and substituting. Rather, we've reinvented the service on some level by the kind of choices that we make, the songs that we sing. I mean, the style of service of sitting in rows, we're still doing. But in other ways, we've tried to re-envision what could be a service, or in the case of a bar bat mitzvah, by allowing students to choose either their Torah portion or even to choose a Hebrew reading from outside, or to choose a hero or an issue out of Jewish history. It's re-envisioning in a brand new way. It's transforming what was, as opposed to simply trying to do a special program for the odd case that wants to do something different. So I'm curious for your thoughts on that, both integration issue and the transforming what is.
So I think it's yes, yes, and yes. Some LGBT synagogues, like Sha'ar Zahav, which is the flagship gay synagogue in San Francisco, 50% of their members now identify as in mixed gender partnerships. That means straight people. So 50%. And in fact, some of the old gay men guard of the founding members of Sha'ar Zahav have been grumbling for years because their synagogue is becoming too straight and too overrun with children. And they're really irritated by that. And so, the composition of the congregation demographically is really changing. Straight people want to send their kids to the religious school there and want to be a part of that congregation because it's progressive and inclusive and accepting. That is transformative integration from the other side, from the gay side. So, do you need separate spaces? Sometimes, yes, you do. Next weekend, in addition to the spiritual Woodstock, is Nehirim, which is a queer Jewish spirituality weekend. They organize retreats all over the country, and out of a need for some sort of gathering outside of a congregational setting that is spiritual and focused on celebrating queer Jewish lives. I think there's a need for that. That's not going to go away anytime soon, and that's fine. I don't have an issue with that. Great. Do you have mainstreaming where some congregations in the Jewish world have a significant percentage of open, visibly gay families and individuals? Yes, and they are transforming those congregations from within. That's awesome. They change the institutional culture, like we talked about last night, or I think Jacques and I talked about it at breakfast. They're the ones signing up for the fundraisers and running the PTA of the religious school, and they are actively members of the congregation, and they're being gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. It's not a big deal because there's a critical mass of them. And so who cares? That's integration. I think that's awesome too. And then I think what you're talking about is a third step, which is a radical reinvention, really. And I know, I feel less arrogant enough to say anything about that because I don't know enough about this movement here to know really how things have been so radically reinvented. But I think that is one approach that's really useful for people to find a way in when they have felt marginalized and like misfits everywhere else to a certain degree. And that's fantastic too. There's room enough for all of us at the table.
Well, I have an audience question. One is, this is beyond the scope of this discussion, but I think it's worth having at least a couple of comments on it. And the question is, why do you use the term queer?
Oh, yeah.
Which is part of the dialogue here as well in terms of both welcoming and understanding people whose life experience is different from what's often called the mainstream.
Do you want to take this question? You use the word queer too.
Sure.
Do you want to?
Oh,
We can both talk about it.
yeah. I mean,
Talk simultaneously.
very, very simply, it saves on letterhead. I mean, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, exploring. Queer is just short for a lot of that. It also is part of a reclaiming strategy that taking the negative energy away from those who would use queer in a hurtful way, like many other epithets. It's like, how many of you have ever jokingly, said to a Jewish friend, hey there, Hebe, or, my fellow kite. It's a kind of a riff on the N-word that is used within the black community or other communities. Again, taking away the negative energy of these terms. But it is also a very nice shorthand. And it's a sort of an elegant, provocative kind of riff. And, of course, in the years of the early years of the growing AIDS, HIV epidemic, ACT UP was very focused on mobilizing many people to fight the disease, and I think then there was also a feeling in the later years of that struggle of the need to affirm the positive of LGBT life, and a group called Queer Nation emerged to help to recreate a positive sense of LGBT queer identity, and the fact that, we're here, we're queer, we're fabulous. Get used to it. And of course, I think more and more people have, is I think that you can see the culture has so radically changed in just a few decades.
So I often get asked that question. When my first book came out, and I tell the story a lot, my Aunt Barbara from Skokie, Illinois, who's now in her 70s, she said, Karen, I love your book. She didn't read it, but whatever. She said, why'd you have to call it queer? She was really anxious and upset about that. And I said, Barbara, I want to give you permission to use the word queer. I want to give all of you here, regardless of what your sexual orientation is, I want to give you permission to use the word queer. But only if you use it in the sense of being an ally. And only if you mean it with good intentions and out of a sense of love and solidarity. Otherwise, you don't get to use the word queer. Okay? It's a movement term of reclamation, like Ben said. It is an act of power and naming that is simultaneously defiant and discomfort producing, and also a loving embrace of who you are. That's all. And I give straight people permission to use the word queer all the time. Because I think as outsiders in that discourse, you need permission to feel like I can use that term unselfconsciously, out of love, out of good intentions, in a way that might raise an eyebrow. But if you're going to use it, you probably have to explain to other confused, puzzled, straight people who are well-intentioned, I give benefit of the doubt, you're going to have to explain why you're using that word, like queer people have to explain why they use the word all the time.
You wanted to follow on the queer subject.
Yeah, just,
And
is this
Yvonne,
on?
you wanted to-
I don't hear this. I'm sorry.
It's not on.
Sorry. Is it on?
Yeah, it's not on.
I just want to add, in addition to all the other uses, that in academia over the past couple of decades, in feminist theory and gender studies, queer studies has become a term that's used in academia as well.
A while ago, when I was reading the book of Israel, and got it from a mutual friend of ours, from Myrna, I kept thinking of what would be the right metaphor, because I'm not even sure that when we look at history and we see Jerusalem in diaspora, or it was always like, because when we think about right after Solomon built the temple, as you know, I'm sure we've heard that story many times, there was a division, and the majority of the people of Israel went up north, and not only did they go up north in Israel, but they also built 2 more temples, just to make sure that nobody will go to the temple in Jerusalem. Now think about it. 10 tribes go up, 2 tribes stay in Judea. Do really the 10 tribes feel that they are diaspora? Well, they're not, because they're in Israel. Okay, so what happens in the Babylon times? Where do they really feel diaspora? And I think it's the terminology, in a way, is sort of, it's hard for me to say that it wasn't relevant, because people always used it, but on the other hand, I think that the normative depends on who decides what the norm is. And the metaphor that I really like is a metaphor that Plato used to describe the Hellenistic culture. And that is, he said that Greeks are just like frogs around a pond being the Mediterranean, and the Greeks being where they are. No center, no diaspora, just around the same pond. Now, the pond could be the 3 words that you used before, or any one of them, or anything else we decide is the central of what it means to be Jewish.
I always got something. And you can actually get back on schedule.
Awesome.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. When do you want to?
So I'll get the last word and then we'll go. I was reminded recently of, it's claimed as a Yiddish saying, but it shows up in other cultures as well. And that is, it's always good to have an open mind, but you shouldn't have such an open mind that your brain falls out.
I call it boundaries of
So here's the question with what you had to say provocatively about denominations and identities and flexidox and all of these other ideas. And it's something that we're going to talk about in our following session, where we're asking the questions of ourselves, the hard questions. What do I do? That is, I'm working in a congregational setting, I'm representing a movement, I'm trying to bring people together through both the cultural Jewish identity and some kind of shared belief system, because after all, if all we are is a group of its members, then we really don't stand for anything, and it becomes anarchy and battles, and we form and we split and we form and we split. We might do that anyways, but at least we'd have a real reason for it that time. And in some ways, I think it is emblematic of that evolution of some in the gay and lesbian community who, in Chicago, there's been a gay and lesbian synagogue for many years, but how they choose their practice is always a challenge, because again, if a large percent of that community is secular oriented, they join it for, supporting the cause, but they don't feel any personal, meaningful connection to them. Then does that get passed on to children? Do they really feel like it's their community in the same way? The same challenge comes about when it comes to looking forward and recruiting people. We always get people who come and say, what are you about? Now, we always try to keep the focus positively. We got a number of questions in past sessions from the audience that said, it's not what we don't believe, it's what we do believe, it's what we do focus on. It's our positive focus on what humans can know, what humans can do. God before the Big Bang, not before the Big Bang, who cares? And that's the term agnostic that Jacques mentioned, that Sherwin liked to use. And there is a slight debate over whether he coined it or not, because he said he didn't, and other people said he did. And unfortunately, the source is unconsultable at the moment. So in the end, this question of agnostic is not just whether or not you know, but whether or not you can know, and whether or not it would make a difference one way or the other. If there's a God before the Big Bang, is that going to change your life? I'm still going to rely on myself. I'm still going to understand the world through science and human knowledge. I'm still going to read history by archaeology and geology and all the tools that we have to know things. In the end, if that doesn't change my life, then keep the positive focus on the humanism, on what we do believe, what we can do, who we are. So if we change this orientation to a positive focus, that's a set of beliefs. We're trying to create a network of communities. That's a movement or a denomination. And if what people are attracted to is not denominationalism, not labels, not telling what they can and can't believe or what they can and can't do, maybe they want to say the traditional Hanukkah blessings, but don't believe any of it. I had this debate at an Israeli school when I was in Israel last time. But they basically said, who cares? I'm just saying it because I'm saying it. And our approach is, well, it could be even more meaningful if you think about it. I don't want to think. I mean, it's sort of the attitude. Maybe I don't want to think that much about it. I don't mind if it's inconsistent, because again, it's the pick and choose cafeteria. We're trying to create a balanced meal, right? We say, well, if you're going to pick this wine, then you should have this food, and then you should have this side dish, and that creates a wonderful appetizing meal. But they don't mind if they have chocolate cake for appetizer, and a glass of milk, and then a steak, and then whatever floats their boat, whatever their tastes appeal to them. And so our challenge is how to, A, get them to choose enough of the same dishes so that we can have a meal together, and B, try to get that presence that Jacques talked about on Friday night. You can't get a building if you've got 35 different organizations all under one congregational or movement organization.
Those are difficult questions. I don't have an answer, but I would just want to tell you one response to that. In Denver, where I live, is a storefront, non-shul, called Judaism Your Way. And they have slick graphics and a beautiful website. And they have a full-time rabbi on staff who was ordained in the Reconstructionist movement, and an executive director and a program coordinator, and they are funded by a big banker in Denver. And it is a non-shul in the sense that the only thing they do that sort of resembles a shul is they have yearly high holiday services, but everything else that they do is really outside the box. And they have a ton of business. I see that as both like opportunity and challenge to think about that as a model. Yes, you are movement building and institution building, and institution building is inherently in its work kind of conservative, and yet you are radical in your approach and your ideas. That's a paradox that I don't think is going to be solved anytime soon. So Judaism Your Way sidesteps that paradox by having a funder that is dedicated to funding them, and they do all sorts of interesting programs like Shabbat in the Park, or they do like 30 to 40 weddings a year. There's a need out there for some sort of spiritual, vaguely or intensely Jewish life cycle things without the trappings of a building and congregational dues and committees and brotherhoods and sisterhoods and all those things that people don't necessarily want to buy into. And that's just what is. I don't know what you should do. I don't have any prescriptive solutions for a
You say
movement.
not to listen to professors too much.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. But I'm just saying that Judaism Your Way was developed as a response to that anti-denominationalism, that anti-congregational impulse that I think is alive and well in Jewish life.
Well, Karen,